is Chiliti Mawala. I actually used to be a professor at this university many years ago. So if I just become a comedian for the moment, before I saw the light. So I am an engineer. I used to be a professor of electrical engineering, just up there. I actually did a PhD in artificial intelligence more than 20 years ago. Obviously now we know that artificial intelligence is actually at the center of the future of work. When I came back to South Africa, I was at Cambridge for the PhD, and I did a postdoc at Imperial College. When I came back, somebody asked me, so what did you do a PhD on? I said, artificial intelligence. Why didn't you do it on real intelligence? So basically what I'm going to, I'll go through a presentation to illustrate some of the things that are coming when it comes to the future of work. So we are obviously living in an era, people call it the fourth industrial revolution. I don't quite like bombastic words, but nonetheless I think it is an important concept for us to understand. I think when the first industrial revolution came about, it was for the first time that machines were used to do work. You know, the mechanization of production had consequences. You know, because before then, if you wanted to plant anything on an industrial scale, you needed lots of people to do that. You even needed animals. So the first industrial revolution happened in England. Why, we don't know. People suspect that it was because of the scientific revolution that preceded it. And it gave us machines. Steam engine is a classic example of that. The second industrial revolution gave us electricity and mass production of goods and services. I'm not going to go through the scientific basis for it. It was at this second industrial revolution that the prospect for horses came to an end. Because much of the transportation was done by horses. In fact, if you look at the population of horses, you can see that after this revolution, the population started going down. The third industrial revolution gave us electronics, and the fourth industrial revolution is going to automate almost everything around us. Some of the technologies that are going to drive the future of work, artificial intelligence is an example, 3D printing, blockchain, smart infrastructure, biomedical engineering, biotechnology. And all these technologies are going to change the nature of work, what we do as a result of this technology as people. Now, maybe just to maybe contextualize it a little bit, artificial intelligence is really a mechanism of designing machines that think like human beings. And within artificial intelligence, you have various types. Machine learning, it's a statistical approach to artificial intelligence. Soft computing, computational intelligence, and inside machine learning, you have deep learning. That is how you learn huge amounts of data, and that's what you call big data. If you are interested in this topic, I wrote a book in it. You can actually go and buy this book. Now, this is this is a picture of a robot that is driving a car. Now, of course, a car does not necessarily need a robot like this, a humanoid to drive. In fact, you can design a car to be self-driving without anybody that even looks like a human being. So the implications of robots such as this in our factories is quite huge. You can see it is able to do the sort of tasks that we normally would associate it with human beings. Of course, human beings still have an advantage over machines, and that advantage is flexibility. We can be able to ask you to go and make coffee, and then we ask you to go and deliver a message to someone else, and ask you to go and read a poem for us. You know, it's very difficult for machines to be that flexible. So artificial intelligence has not been able to transcend specific tasks that are designed for it to be able to do. But as you can see, it is doing quite a sophisticated type of work. And this is not remote control. You know, it is doing it autonomously. So this is really how the future of work is going to look like. It is going to be driven by machines. And of course, it will have impact on what we do as human beings going forward. This robot obviously can learn, it can sense, it can react, it can drive, it can walk. Because it can do all those things, we can probably think it is almost human. It is artificially intelligent as a result. But there are many other things that it cannot be able to do. It cannot fall in love, for example. And it is not conscious. And consciousness is a very important concept that defines us as human beings. But can it be recruited by COSATU? But what the other industrial revolutions gave us, it gave us factories, and because of the structure of the economy that existed in the first, second, and the third industrial revolution, exploitation became a big issue that workers were much more concerned about. So trade unions were formed in order to fight exploitation. Now, in the fourth industrial revolution, we won't be fighting exploitation, we'll be fighting irrelevance. And you cannot be able to reorganize trade unions to fight irrelevance, against irrelevance, as opposed to fighting against exploitation. It's much, much difficult to do. So this is really the factory of the future. Now, since we are talking about economics, the economic impact of all this, just share that it's not only the work that is done manually that is going to change. Much of economic activities are now done by machines. You know, I'm old enough to remember when the stock exchange was downtown. You still remember? And people are not, the young people you won't remember. So people would be shouting at prices and so on and so forth. You know what was the requirement for you to work on the floor of a stock market? Height was very, very important. Voice was very, very important. If you had a soft voice, because people were shouting for prices, and if you were not tall, a tall person probably will have an advantage over you. If your voice is soft, a person with a stronger voice will have an advantage over you. But all these things, whether it is in banks where credit scoring, you have all these people used to be in banks, and you will go and look for a loan, and they are going to score you, and then they decide whether you get a credit or not. All those tasks now are done by machines. In fact, there is now a test that somebody a colleague of mine is trying to develop. How do you know that your work will be automated? And the test, according to my colleague, is that if a task, you would do a task in less than a minute, then it will be automated because it's not a very complex task. But these technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are actually changing even economic theory. The principle of demand and supply. When you go to Pick n Pay, you get a price that was derived from the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. But when you go to Amazon, and we have done an experiment on this, where me and a friend of mine in Brazil bought the same book almost at the same time, and were given two different prices. And the reason for that was because Amazon is able to understand your individual demand curve, and therefore it is able to price individually for you. Rational expectation and rational choice. You know, in behavioral economics that human beings are not rational. Herbert Simon is well known for proposing the theory of bounded rationality. Now, what happens to all these theories? Bounded rationality, rational choice, information asymmetry of Stiglitz, when decisions are now being made by machines. Now, just to give you an example, the bounds that Simon Herbert prescribed of our rationality are actually moved for better rationality when we use machines as opposed to human beings. The information asymmetry that exists between customers and sellers, which won Stiglitz a Nobel Prize with Archaeologists, is actually being reduced, almost eliminated. You know, the idea that a supplier will hide information or a seller will hide information from a buyer is becoming a distant past because of information that is available about people. Game theory, another example, you know, game theory is limited to two-player games. Anything else is approximation. Now you can use multi-agent systems to be able to do that. Mechanism design, reverse game theory, causality and counterfactuals. Again, you know, what is the future of the concept of clinical trials if we can be able to simulate things on machines? Of course, this is another work that we maybe just back again. You can buy two books that we wrote. I wrote this with Evan Hewitt. How is the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution changing the practice of economics, and how is it changing the theories of economics? This is another example of the work that used to be done by political scientists. You know, these are analysts that you see. They want to see whether two countries are going to go to war or not. And of course, now we find out that machines are able to do this much better than human beings. Scary, isn't it? You know? Machines are able to do this much better. We tested this. Of course, it uses variables, distances between two countries, differences in military expenditure, number of trade, agreements between two countries, and after that we come up with a score that determines whether two countries are going to have a conflict. This is not necessarily just military conflict, you know. So it does include the conflict between the People's Republic of China and the United States, the trade conflict. This book that we wrote was also translated into Mandarin. They even translated my name. So Ma in Chinese, in Mandarin, means a horse. And Wa means a gutter of a roof. And La means to pull. So I am a puller of a horse from the gutter of a roof. Now, you know, this is another work that I did 2 years back. You know, because people say all these things, they will only affect things that require physical effort, not things that require quite high-level cognitive capabilities. So here we design a population of intelligent agents, and we observe that these intelligent objects, softwares, are able to learn how to bluff, and are able to bluff. And I am definitely not bluffing. Now, this is actually quite a high-level thing. You know? Now, what is the implication of this? Does it mean that the psychologist of the future is going to be a machine? And what is the implication of that on us as human beings? I think as we move forward, what we are supposed to do is to learn how human beings are going to operate with machines. This is really what we should concentrate on. We are not going to be able to stop the progress of technology. It has been tried before. Apparently, when electricity was discovered, the Candle Making Association of the United States was very worried about what is going to happen to all these people who were employed in the candle making factories. Of course, they couldn't stop the progress of technological change, and we are not going to be able to stop that progress. What we have to do is to study how we are going to interact with human beings. We're supposed to study how automation is going to do, to impact on jobs. The recent work that we have studied, in developmental economics, there is a theory called the two-sector economy theory. It was proposed by Arthur Lewis. He won the Nobel Prize in 1978. And basically, his theory says was studying on how you move people from the agricultural age to industry. So you have two sectors. I think President Thabo Mbeki used to call this two economies. So what he will say is that you move people from the underdeveloped sector to the developed sector. When it expands the developed sector, you don't use it to increase the wages of that sector, but for expansion of that sector. And you do this, and you can do this until you reach an equilibrium. It's called a Lewis turning point. And at the Lewis turning point, the cost of your labor in your underdeveloped market sector starts increasing. That is a Lewis turning point. The Chinese have done a study to see when did they reach their Lewis turning point, and they are estimating that they reached their Lewis turning point in 2009. And from 2009, the cost of labor in China just started rising up. And that is why now products that normally would be made, like suits, they would be made in China. Now they are being made in Vietnam or India. So we can actually use the same concept to understand what is going to happen to people if we move labor from the human-intensive labor market to the robot-intensive labor market. I don't know whether you can call it robot labor, but you get the gist. Almost the same thing. You have some turning point that will be defined by how complex the tasks that are being expected by that particular work is expected. Because if it is too expensive, then the type of a robot that will require will obviously be much more sophisticated and much more expensive. This is a picture of the work. I actually did this work with Nadim Mohammed when I was a professor at this university. So what you see here, that graph is taken from somebody's head. You know, they have something called the EEG signal. You put it on top of your head, it almost looks like a cap. And then they measure the brain activity. So what doctors do, they look at this picture and they're able to tell whether the person is about to experience or is experiencing epilepsy or not. And then that's what they do. But now we actually use a neural network, a type of artificial intelligence, to be able to do exactly the same task. You know, the accuracy that Nadim Mohammed was able to get was over 90% accuracy. An experiment was done where we gave 100 doctors 100 pictures that look like this. And we ask them, make a diagnosis. When they make their diagnosis, 100 by 100 is 10,000. We stored the diagnosis that they have made. A month later, we gave them the same information and asked them to do the same tasks again. They changed their minds 50% of the time. Changing their minds when you are a doctor, that's what you call misdiagnosis. And obviously, because this is a health matter, somebody can probably hurt themselves because of that misdiagnosis. So there are areas where machines, we have no choice. We have to do machines because the outcome is just better than what human beings are able to do. This is another example. I did this with Simon Scarlett, was our master student here at the University of the Witwatersrand. is pulmonary embolism. Again, you look at the picture and then you make a diagnosis. Again, the same type of conclusions we were reached. In fact, The Economist had an article, a cover title, on the future of radiology. That radiology as a discipline is going to be completely disseminated simply because computers seem to perform the tasks that radiologists do much better than the doctors. Again, this is another example. You still remember when this bridge collapsed? You know, it collapsed, it's incidental, people died, you know. So another example of work that you can be able to use a machine to be able to listen to the vibration of that structure so that you are able to predict that calamity before it actually exists. Again, a machine is replacing a fairly complicated task because you couldn't listen to this using your ear. My grandmother used to make clay pots, and she would go and get clay, and then she would make a clay pot, and then she would put it in the sun, and then she would go and bake it, and then she would sell the bitter pots. But at the end of the whole process, she will knock the pots to listen to the sound. If the sound is too, if it doesn't ring for a long time, it's a bad pot. It's going to break very, very fast. If it is able to ring for a long time, then it's a good pot. She will go and sell it. Now, as she was growing old, we realized that she was disposing very, very good pots. Why? Because the hearing was deteriorating. So again, it's an example of, and it's a similar technology. It's just that instead of listening, you have measuring the accelerometers that listen to the same thing and then are able to make sense. Again, these are work that is being done. Finally, it's an example of a dam, monitoring the performance of a dam using cameras and using artificial intelligence to be able to analyze that. This is a patent that we registered. We are able to do this very, very well. I remember when I was growing up, in my village, there used to be a dam. It's called Komkate Dam. Komkate, for those of you who do not know Afrikaans, it means come and look. Komkate. And there used to be these people who used to come wearing very fancy dresses to come and check what is happening there. Of course, they were employed to do that. I don't think today you need them to come and do that. It was impressive. In fact, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a dam inspector because their uniforms was quite impressive. Now, of course, it does all sorts of things. Technology is able to do all sorts of things, but it also picks up other things from humans that are not desirable. We're able to find out that some of these technologies that are being developed are discriminating against Africans. You know, the iPhone 10 does not work quite well. Its facial recognition does not work quite well on African faces because the databases that have been used were largely gathered in North America. You know, the speech recognition tools do not work very well on closer kids since they are noise. Again, we need to develop technology that will be able to understand such things. Now, in conclusion, anything you can do, artificial intelligence can be able to do that. And I think we need to reflect on that as we reflect on the future of work. Now, the consequences of all this, we are entering what is called the post-work era. We need to make sense of that. We need to make sense of how do we deal with the issue. We developed tools to be able to deal with exploitation of the workers. Trade unionism is one of the tools that we have developed. We initiated legislation against discrimination in the workplace. But how are we going to handle irrelevance? Because you know, exploitation, there is an element of exploitation, there is a great deal of unfairness, but irrelevance, unfairness is not straightforward. There's going to be an increase in inequality in society because those with means to buy the means of production, will simply buy those means. But the other corollary to that is that who is going to buy whatever they produce if people are out of their jobs? It's almost secular. What is going to be casualized? I think the trade unionism is actually coming to an end. I think in the era of automation, the trade unionism is going to decrease. I think corporates are going to rule governments. Our freedoms are already bounded. You are no longer free. If you are on Facebook or Twitter, you are being watched. You see, there is a story, I think it is Fallis, that when Europeans came to South Africa, they went to some villages and they gave mirrors in exchange of land. I think it was neither. But many of you have entered into similar transactions. You have given up all your data in exchange for an email address, or a Facebook account, or a Twitter account. And if you check, I don't know how much it costs to maintain an email account by Google, but I think it's very cheap. Almost costs nothing. But the data that they collect from you is a lot of money. They are billionaires many times over for no other reason except the fact that they have your data. So freedom is going to be okay. Can you imagine if there was somebody carrying a machine gun following every move? They don't even have to be following a machine gun. Somebody just following you to see what you're doing. It's unacceptable, But exactly that is happening when you are subscribed to this thing. In fact, even when you log off, it still tracks you, tracks your movement. I think we need to. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think I took more time than you gave me.
So, if it's right, while Amy's reading that, I was told to start with a little bit of an introduction, and this may give you a sense of the comments I'm going to make as well. Yeah. So I really appreciate the presentation by Professor Marwala. Everything that's presented within it has a huge amount of validity in terms of what's obtaining around us at the moment. But it's being approached from a particular perspective. And this is where I'm hoping, by contributing, we can expand that perspective a little bit. So, kind of the school of economics I come from, because we're meant to be rethinking economics during this. Apparently, I have a PhD from the School of Economics. It's from Lund University. But my degree is in political economy. So it may be a little bit different. The work I do sometimes gets called neo-Schumpeterian or evolutionary economics. So within that, the notion of equilibrium is our major source of contention. We don't adopt an equilibrium position. There is no optimality. There is continuous change. And each level of change advances society. But in advancing, elements from the past continue to exist. We don't start on tabula rasa. There's no green field. It wasn't as if you'd excuse us, if we take 1994 as a democratic breakthrough, we pressed the button, and on the 2nd of April, what was it, 28th of April? Yeah, we were in a new South Africa. Yeah, that's not true. Yeah. So in this, what I want to add to and contribute to widen what Professor Marwala has presented excellently is around those issues. They're about context, they're about history, and it locates this transition within wider processes. So I'm also cognizant time-wise Arthur Lewis at Manchester, yeah, spoke about transitions from agriculture to industry. Correctly so, when he wrote. And that's almost 6-7 decades ago. Yeah, helped with Ghana quite a bit. Part of that transition, and I would encourage people to also note, it's not just a transition from agriculture to industry. It's a transformation from a peasantry to a proletariat. And that's a part which I'm not hearing enough of. And this is the parts I want to emphasize with you. We look at the same timelines as it's been laid out, but we must start to question the World Economic Forum's periodization, because unfortunately in economics it does not hold. So what I'm going to go through, a lot of this is a lot of text. It was used for other purposes. I'm putting it up there, and some of it may be of use to you. At the end there's a long list of references that people can. But the approach, which I heard in the plenary, it's important to explain this up front, is one in which describes the anatomy of South African society through studying the development of productive forces, and as a consequence of those productive forces, the emergence of relations of ownership and exclusion. Yeah. So it's about possession and dispossession as well. And they take place during that timeline that we've seen. Yeah. And that's what leads me to, on the 28th, if I'm right, the minerals energy complex, as people in this building and elsewhere have argued very strongly, persists. In other words, that was not changed by elections. Yeah. So, I also want to maybe sound a warning note. With all that we've heard, the technologies are critically important, they are being developed. We have to be part of it. Yes. But will we be slaves to it, or will we lead in it? And that's where we need a lot more, like the last slide, the one that I removed. That's the emphasis we need to be placing. It's not just to be a fast follower, but it's how, based on the competence that we develop through it, that we can hope to achieve the goals for democratizing the society that we are in, and redress the legacies that we continue to see around us. Yeah. So I make that point because, and that's David Noble's book about the way in which production lies at the core of societies and how societies premise themselves on this production system. Why? Because there's a biological fact underneath it. Of all the myriad forms of living things on this planet, and remember it's only the planet that we have. Yeah, there weren't spaceships in the parking lot, even though it was difficult to find parking this morning. Yeah. This planet that we live on, that production system that we are talking about develops technologies. But we must, and I would encourage, never assume that these technologies are inevitable. And neither is their consequences. Yeah. We have to remain extremely critical because certain choices have been made that led to the investment, like Prof. was raised, studying artificial intelligence. If we didn't have a field developed around artificial intelligence when Prof was teaching it here, we would not be talking about it today. In a similar form, if we don't make social choices about the future, they won't exist, and we'll expect the machines to fix our problems. Currently, we have human beings that we question whether they have the capacity to fix our problems. So, over the long timeline, 13 to 7 million years of evolution of ourselves as a species, we're the last extent of that species in hominids. Yeah? We have developed with technology. Technology has co-evolved with us. That's why we get to 7.6 billion. Yeah? Different parts of the world across time, and this is a timeline in the common era from the mythical year 1 to where we are currently, have contributed variously to the total output of the world. But I want to draw your attention very specifically to the period between 1700 and 1820. I'm not going to talk about the settlers that arrived here in 1820,
But during that gap between 1700 and 1820 is the Industrial Revolution, what Prof pointed out as the first. Now you start seeing the differential once this Industrial Revolution takes place. Remember, we have slavery taking place as well, and the drop in Africa's contribution can be attributed to the removal physically of millions of people from this continent. That doesn't feature in that other periodization from the World Economic Forum, does it? Yeah. As we've progressed, we call it progress, if we see it hierarchically, yeah, we've generated outcomes that have negatively affected the planet that we live in. That's in Earth systems. At the same time, what we consider progress, these socio-economic trends, need to be brought into question. At what cost are we achieving it? Yeah? So, a scientist in Russia who also studied a bit of economics, called Kondratiev, looked at these expansions over capitalism's history. And through the work that he had originally started doing, which was then followed by a range of economists, yeah, most prominently Chris Freeman from Sussex, together with Carlota Perez, and a whole range of scholars subsequently, yeah, have been able to show how at least 5 waves have preceded us, and that we sit on the cusp of the 6th. I've used this slide specifically so that you don't see Verso or Pluto Press as the publisher underneath. This is coming from a research council from Canada, and they themselves are looking at it in a wider context. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we using that abridged number 4 in terms of where we are? I want you also to pay attention to the fact that this 5th wave, the information and communications revolution, starts the end of the 60s and the early 70s. So what does that tell us in terms of where we are, in terms of catching up with what's gone before us? So playing this out in detail, what we've seen, first great surge under capitalism from 1771 was, of course, that Industrial Revolution, followed by an age of steam, railroads, that took place around the early 1800s, followed by age of steel and heavy engineering, age of oil, displacement, as Prof has raised, yeah, no more horse carriages, and it had a huge effect on all those industries built around it. Yeah? ICT, without the transistors, and there's a whole description that we could go through, but I leave that also for you to read and also try to fill these things in. But you'd see, and once we start seeing this in a pattern, we try to discern what's driving this process. Can we understand it in a flow? Hence we reach this type of S-curve, describing a technological life cycle, yeah? Which shows how technologies get inserted into society. Yeah? There's a frenzy as they build up. Yeah? It reaches a point where it's expanded to its full potential and a maturity follows, where goods and services, a whole plethora of things become available, built off that infrastructure. I'm emphasizing this point, built off that infrastructure, because I want us to think critically about the periodization of South Africa in this context and ask ourselves, over these 5 technological surges within the current mode of production, what has South Africa gained, or Southern Africa, or Africa as a whole? We can even go further and talk about the global South in that. Because we weren't necessarily benefiting from the type of infrastructures that were being laid down. Yeah? So there's much more detail about it, and it's also notable how this fits in with the type of bubbles that arise from a hype that's generated, and overinvestment. The term we use in evolutionary economics is creative destruction. That's the Schumpeterian concept, yeah? Where what's being introduced destroys what existed before. And I want to suggest to you that in South Africa we've had incomplete creative destruction. Yeah? We have a lot of creativity throwing new things in. We've had very little done to destroy what existed before. And this is not a bad thing. I'm just basing this on what I've been told was a presentation in Parliament on the land question. Yeah. So when we look at this in this form, yeah, waves of techno-economic paradigms and how they've changed. The first wave generated increases in productivity, massively expanding the range of goods and services available. You'll see that's what that curve measures. Rate of innovation and the timeline towards us. This I'd like us to pay particular attention to as we engage on the topic. Yeah? As we engage on the topic itself. If we were to ascribe 100 units as the output generated by those industrial workers in 1760, we give that a unit 100. We're now looking at a rate of exploitation where productivity is close to 3,000. I'm sure you're amazed. This is not what's in the press. Where is the benefit of this massive increase? That's where you get, again, slightly falsely claimed, but there's no use contesting these numbers, 1% and 99%. Truth being told, it's been whittled down to 0.76% and the rest of us. Yeah? That's the huge difference. And that is the absorption, the appropriation of this massive productivity. That's the aggregates on a world scale within world systems itself. Yeah? So you get a sense, this version is very useful maybe for some descriptive purposes, but this periodization doesn't fit. And it's quite important. All of these hold true. They're absolutely true. These are actually taking place. We need to be part of it. But we need to be circumspect about the possibility of leapfrogging if we want to prevent leapfrogging into a chasm. Yeah? Something that we know nothing about, and the features around us continue to persist and breed underdevelopment. Right? And of course, Prof. clearly outlined this. I won't go into this detail, but you can see from the type of what existed in the last century, the forms of production through products and services led to particular jobs, vocations. That is changing, and we need to empower people to be involved in this creatively, yeah, and with a futures orientation. For the blacksmiths that worked on horses and carriages, the automobiles did not give them jobs. Yeah. So now some of the critique. Yeah, and I really worry that sometimes if we aren't clearly orientating ourselves to redressing what's around us at the moment and hoping that somehow the fourth industrial revolution is going to fix South Africa's developmental challenges, we may run into problems. Yeah. And there's a whole range of reasons for this, which the power, the so-called question of national sovereignty within world systems is coming into full view. You know, of course, the question of who rates the performance of a country's economy and how then our indebtedness priced. Yeah, this isn't based on whether South African citizens' lives are improving, but rather whether we continue to pay these monies across the border and whether we guarantee that expropriation continuing. Yeah. Also, it's quite important to note in this, I would be quite concerned. I think these notions about technology doing things better, it's doing things better with people. Technologies in and of themselves don't do anything. Yeah. It's quite important remembering this. Yeah? There's a huge range of possibilities in terms of technologies augmenting unsafe work or work that is dangerous to people can be supported through the use of technologies. It has been over time. And we need to do much more about that, but that demands an agile governance system. And if you look at the, I was going to use very clear economic terms to describe it, I'll drop that. Yeah. When we looked at the National Treasury being surprised by the recession, we need to be concerned about the agility of the governance system in place. Yeah? Why? Because that data is coming to you continuously. It's not something you switch the computer on and, oh, we're in a technical recession today, because Stats South Africa said so. Yeah? So there are winners and losers, and we need to pay attention to that. I'm not going to go through this in detail, hopefully in the discussion. Please think of our history and locate it within that periodization. Yeah? South Africa never achieved full proletarianization, but people had the means of production removed from them. Hence, the homeland system and what went accompanying it. Yeah? And this continued over time. And what we've seen in the most recent period as well is that the political economy shifting from racial capitalism to different forms of racialized capitalism that we currently experience itself. And that's on the notion of a mixed market-led system. Yeah. I know there's no time, so I want also to point out, as I read Professor Marwala on one of the slides, of course, liberating us from work is important. Yeah. Marx did not argue we need to work harder or work more. He argued we must destroy capitalism, which is preventing us from realizing our own selves. This is an important notion through this. So when we talk and we treat trivially the issue of employment, unemployment in front of us, bear in mind these absolute numbers, which I'm looking in the room, most of your age cohort is going to see just now, right? We only have 16.4 million people employed in South Africa. We have 57.7 million people as a population. Yeah. Look at those outside of the formal productive sector. Yeah. 6 plus 2.8 plus 12.5 million people. Yeah. Look at the age cohort that we are talking about, 15 to 24-year-olds. Yeah. These are increasing in terms of those not in employment, education or training. So I thought this was brilliant, and also the Prof may appreciate this as well, coming from a physicist this time as opposed to a social scientist. Yeah. Stephen Hawking, before he died, was asked this question on Reddit. Yeah. He was asked, do you foresee a world where people work less because so much work is done, is automated? And his response is, I think, brilliant. If machines produce everything we need, the outcome will depend on how things are distributed. Everyone can enjoy a life of luxurious leisure if the machine-produced wealth is shared. Or most people can end up miserably poor if the machine owners successfully lobby against wealth redistribution. Okay. This is earlier this year. So far, the trend seems to be towards the second option, with technology driving ever-increasing inequality. Right? So that's a man that's past us. Yeah? It's important to recognize physicists can also think about social science and respond based on their experiences. But let's look at what South Africa's private sector is saying about the fourth industrial revolution. Yeah? They expect it's going to bring upheavals. Yeah? But look at this. South African executives do not believe they have as much influence over this as executives globally. They're the ones making the choices about what gets applied, but they feel that South African executives, as opposed to the whole set, this was out of 1,603 global executives, 100 of which were from South Africa. Yeah? These 100 South Africans says they would much more focus on changing the regulatory environment than engage directly with what Prof was saying is becoming irrelevant, the trade unions that represent organized workers. Right, so I'm about wrapping up. Yeah? Should we really be scared? I would remind us all, what we need to be scared about is the perpetuation of capitalism and its persistence beyond its lifespan. Yeah? It has led to huge developments over the 6 techno-economic paradigms that have expanded the scope and provided goods and services. But now in late capitalism, what we're seeing is really barbarism and the choice of fascism facing us globally as well. Yeah. So we must be careful that this capital bias, that's what those machines represent, yeah, are there because they reduce costs and boost profitability. They're not being introduced because they serve people's needs. Yeah. I can do this in more detail, but I just want to let that hang there. Yeah. Even the technicians involved in ICTs themselves are concerned at the way in which ICTs are being applied. So this Internet Society, I would know this crowd, yeah, technicians, they call themselves techies. I'm quite proud of it as well. They are the ones objecting to Trump's use of ICTs in kicking out people that he considers to be not welcome in the USA at the moment. So they are even challenging this thing called ICE because of the technologies being used to track and trace people. And they themselves are saying, not our technologies for that purpose. Yeah? So, the conclusion I want to reach is just drawing across. Klaus Schwab promises us in his book, please do read it as well. With these fundamental transformations underway, we have the opportunity to proactively shape this fourth industrial revolution. He says the revolution is about much more than technology. It's an opportunity to unite global communities, build sustainable economies, adapt and modernize governance models, reduce material social inequalities, and commit to value-based leadership of emerging technologies. I think we should hold him and the members of the World Economic Forum to account for exactly what they promise us through the fourth industrial revolution. To be more critical, we should approach this transition being quite clear about how previous transitions, we can only learn from history. We have no memories of the future. And historically, how have forces of production changed and its consequences for relations of production over the period of capitalism? And through that, we'd understand the type of political economy that's going to emerge. And this means building our capacities and capabilities. And that's where I link back to the last two slides raised by Professor Marwala and fully subscribe to them as they are raised there. Yeah? But you would see the difference in approach is how did we get there? Thank you very much.
Informal employment, globalizing and organizing. Apologies for the big mouthful. We're a global organization with about 50 staff worldwide. We work with 4 sectors in the informal economy. We work with waste pickers, we work with street vendors, domestic workers and home-based workers particularly, but we also do a lot of policy and research work on informal workers more generally across the whole spectrum. And I head a section of WeGo which deals specifically with organizing and supporting the organizations of informal workers. I'm a little bit sort of, this is a really interesting space to be in because it's not a space I'm very used to, this whole debate around high-level technology and robotics, particularly in relation to informal workers. But I'm going to try and respond to many of the issues raised. I do think that the quote from Stephen Hawkins, maybe we must really bear in mind as a sort of key touchstone. We need to constantly ask ourselves the question, whose hands does technology sit in and to whose advantage, and who are the groupings of people in society that are benefiting from developments in technology. And I think as has been very well demonstrated, there is a correlation between deepening inequality and increases in technology. And somehow we have to find a way of reversing that. And I would argue from the perspective of someone who's working with informal workers, having worked in the formal trade union movement for 35 years and having been very familiar with the much more industrial sectors of the workforce. Now I would argue that if we're going to find the answers, we have to make a big effort to factor into our analysis and factor into our understanding and factor into our acknowledgement and our recognition the huge numbers of workers and of people who are either excluded completely from generating any kind of livelihood or are generating a livelihood through informal activity. And I just want to show you, I wasn't intending to show you these slides, but I'm going to select a couple. Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm going to abandon that. It's too complicated. So, if we look worldwide at the levels of informal employment, South Asia, 82% of all workers in the economies of South Asia on average, the aggregate, 82% of workers, ranging from 62% in Sri Lanka and 84% in India. East and Southeast Asia, 65%. Sub-Saharan Africa, 66%. Middle East and North Africa, 45%. Latin America, 51%. Going back to Sub-Saharan Africa, where on average 2/3 of those in some kind of work are working informally. In South Africa, the proportion is 33%. So 1 in every 3 worker in South Africa, documented through the Quarterly Labour Force Survey, is working informally, and that's the lowest proportion in the whole of Africa. So we're talking about vast numbers of people who are largely hidden from any kind of economic analysis, any kind of political analysis, any kind of policy analysis, and so forth. And so when we talk about the debate about technology, we have to remind ourselves how many people there are who are, and if we take into account the points that have been made already about technology being very much currently being driven by capital investment, by the desire to increase profits, reduce labor costs and so on, particularly in the formal manufacturing sectors, but also in other formal sectors, then we can see that there's a whole myriad of economic activities which are just not recognized or taken into account, either in analyzing the problem or in looking for the solutions. So if we come to South Africa specifically, we have 4.5 million workers who are informally employed. Some of those sit in the formal economy. They're in manufacturing, they're in services and so on, and they're informal by virtue of the fact that the employer is non-compliant with the law. Those workers don't have a contract, they're subcontracted, or they are employed through labor brokers, many of them. They're invisible, they don't have UIF deductions, they don't have contributions to pension provident fund and so on, and therefore in our statistics they show up as informal workers. And the bottom line is that they're only informal because their employers are breaking the law, and their status in employment could be turned on its head overnight if only the employer was forced to comply, either through trade union action and organization or through intervention by the state through Department of Labour inspectors and so on, which, as we know, is a very weak inspectorate as we speak. So of those 4.5 million who are informally employed, 2.8 million are in the informal economy. So I'm sorry to sort of introduce these different terminologies, but the informal economy is basically that section of the economy, and there is a debate about whether we can use terms like informal economy versus formal economy, because many of us would argue that there really is only one economy. But for the purposes of description, I'm using the term informal economy. Informal economy, which is basically very small firms of employing less than 5 people, where there isn't the obligation to there are different regulations on tax compliance and registration of employees and so on. But it also includes vast numbers of own account workers, your street vendor on the street, your waste picker on the street, and also more highly skilled workers who work for themselves out of their own homes would also be included in those numbers. But the vast majority are your typical informal worker who many of us see every day around us but never acknowledge as being contributors in any way to the overall economy. And of course, the vast majority of those, particularly in the informal economy, who are own account workers, working for themselves, and who many analysts and policymakers like to pretend are aspirant entrepreneurs. They are not aspirant entrepreneurs. They are people who are making a survivalist livelihood, who are completely and utterly cut off from new technological developments, or almost cut off from new technological developments, because they don't have the capital to access those new technologies. Just to give you an example, we in WeGo organize waste pickers or reclaimers. You will all be familiar with those women and men who you see pulling trolleys in the streets or collecting at your doorstep on the day of waste collection, and separating and collecting out the plastics and the aluminium and so on. Those workers' livelihoods are so low that most of them can't afford a basic, more than a very, very basic cell phone. But having a higher level technology cell phone would help those workers not only in their self-organizing, but also in their access to knowing prices that are being paid by middlemen into the value chain. So very, very basic things like that. You'll also have noticed that many of the trolleys that are used are really quite inefficient and unable to carry the loads that the workers are pulling. That's also a technological question of access to technology. So, we have to, first of all, change our mindset to recognize that these millions of workers who are making a livelihood and are surviving off that livelihood through informal economic activity have to be incorporated in our analysis and in our policy making. So again, another example of the integration ultimately of the two economies into one. And here I will try and put up a couple of illustrations if I can. The worker, for example, who makes a pinafore dress at home using a sewing machine, probably a similar sewing machine that's used in a garment factory, but who produces it at home and sells it in the market in Warwick Avenue in Durban. Who's here from Durban? Warwick Avenue, I'm sure you're familiar with. There's a huge section where women sell pinafore dresses. All of them produced in the home, using a sewing machine, using the product, the material made in a garment factory, a textile factory. So the connections between what is ultimately sold in the Warwick Avenue market, the person who makes the pinafore, and the manufacturing sector, there is a direct connection between those economic activities. But the worker who's producing that pinafore dress and then selling it or passing it on to someone else to sell in some cases is not recognized at all in any of the sort of economic calculations of contribution to gross domestic product, etc. The same goes for the person who sells cell phone airtime. You know, one of the biggest industries in South Africa, the cell phone industry, and yet the person who sells the airtime, on whom the big companies is completely dependent, is not recognized in the value chain at all. So, yeah, I've got a message here that I've got 0 time left. So I'm just begging you, all of you who are aspirant or current economists, please try and factor in, both when you're looking at issues of technology, but more generally, policy and analysis questions, factor in these huge numbers of people who are making an enormous contribution overall to the economy of the country, and who deserve much better in terms of policy support, interventions by local authorities to regulate in a way that is friendly rather than in a way that is antagonistic, and to provide the infrastructure and the technological support that would enable these large numbers of informal workers to improve their livelihoods and therefore to improve their livelihoods and be more recognized in our society. Thanks.
I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. What Russ ended off was what I want to pick up from. Now, of course, Schumpeter draws a lot from Marx, but calls himself an anti-Marxist, which is interesting. But nevertheless, the insight is very important. Now, Paul Mason has just recently published a book called Post-Capitalism. And I think Professor Mawala might find it interesting to read, just to complement the analysis and to get away from I thought your presentation was wonderful, but you locked us into a prison of no alternatives, no unions, a dystopian world, whereas what Jane is talking about actually is a lot of space for unionization in the economy. And what he argued, he said artificial intelligence presents precisely this opportunity that Marx himself envisaged. That Marx wasn't anti-technology, but he was all about how technology is used for the benefit of society. And his vision of communism was precisely that we will be free from the burdens of work or employment for others, but work that is enriching for ourselves, and fish in the morning, write poetry in the afternoon, make love in the evening, and do community work. Right? And this is, and Mason, and I'm not saying Mason's book is perfect, but it's suggestive of how, she talks about what has opened up is that we are in a period of secular stagnation of the capitalist economy. Why? Because of zero marginal cost of all these services that are provided. They are worried. Everything is free, all this free stuff that technology is giving us. How do we monetize it? Right? And every time they try to monetize it, others will invent something new as a counter-reaction. So it's a real challenge for the capitalist class. So ultimately, it's not a technological question, it's a political question that underpins all of this. And that's really that's why political economy, that's why we need political economy. So I'm just, let's throw that in.
Yvonne Thomas from the Open Society Foundations. And I'm not an economist, and I have to admit, I'm one of those people where a lot of it goes whoo over my head when people start talking about economics. But one of the things that we were hearing earlier was about economic theory sometimes doesn't seem to take account of people. And it should, because fundamentally economics should be about people and providing livelihoods and welfare for people. And then we heard about technology, the line that what happens if technology no longer evolves with us? What happens when a capitalist system finds that robots can do it better than people? So then you don't even need people. I'm just a little bit, I'm wondering, will there come a point where actually, in a pure economic sense, people are completely surplus to requirements? Will we ever get to a situation like that? Or what would be needed? How do you always ensure that people are needed in that system? I'm hoping that from a non-economist point of view, I've expressed it in a way that you can grab it. Thank you.
Would any of you like to respond to that?
I can.
Oh, okay, let's take the third question first, yeah, which is back there, yeah. Oh, it was you, I'm sorry.
My name is Simo Zulu. I'd like to pose this question to Professor Marala. And when you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and I'm looking at the implications for higher education or the post-school education system in our country, particularly with graduates that exit the PSET system to be in the labor market, and the constant refrain that's made by the business that you have graduates that don't have the adequate skills that are needed by industry. Now, the question that I would like to ask is, with this background and the technological advances that would come, or that are there with the fourth industrial revolution, and some of them you have mentioned, what would be the response, or implications first, and the response of higher education institutions, universities, TVET colleges, particularly looking at issues of programs and qualifications that they would be offering in the context of these changes, and the relevance to the system and industry as well. Thanks.
Now, I think I can try to answer some of these questions. Devin, I was giving a unique view. I was just giving my perception of what I see happening. Because unfortunately, the economic system that is in place is based on the principles of utilitarianism, maximization of profit. And until we remove that, the drive will always be towards the maximization of that, even if it comes at the expense of labor, and so on and so forth. So this is the world in which we are living in. And what is different is that it will require fewer people to produce. I mean, those are facts. And I don't think that the answer is to try to insert people into production, even if it does not make any economic sense. I think we need to identify other answers. Some people are even thinking about issues of universal basic income. In fact, it was proposed ironically by Elon Musk. Obviously he was doing it from an economic perspective, that if we're producing all these goods, who is going to buy them? So I think we should view the reality as it is and craft responses that will be able to deal with that reality. Yvonne, I think I've answered my take on the importance of people. Simo, you are right. Higher education will need to change. And my view, and I said it in the last slide, and we don't do it very well in South Africa, is that higher education must become much more multidisciplinary. Those who are doing human and social sciences will necessarily have to understand technology and study technology. Those who are doing technological subjects such as engineering will necessarily have to understand human and social sciences. In fact, the Americans have been doing this very, very well. I was an undergraduate student in North America. And my first degree was in mechanical engineering. I transferred from the University of Cape Town. And when they showed me the curriculum, I was wondering, is this engineering? They told me that I have to take 12 semesters of human and social science. That was not even a question of choice. You have to take it. The choice was that you can take anything, you know, as long as 6 of them are in one subject, one area. So I did take 2 acting classes. And for those of you who are wondering, why am I not in gender relations? And I think that's very, very important. And if you look at the economy, the new economies that have emerged, you know, the new technological economies, haven't you wondered why Germany is not at play? Because Germany is traditionally a very strong technological. What happens to these German engineers? What happens to British engineers? You don't see them. You know. We don't have a British version of Facebook, or we don't have a German version of Facebook or Twitter. And the reason for that is because, you know, in Europe, education is too specialized, and the British take it to another level. Already, when they are doing A levels, they have already dropped their subjects to at most 4 subjects. You know, and that's still in high school. And I am saying that the kind of skills that are required in the 4th industrial revolution, you know, are those skills that have human touch. You wouldn't necessarily want a robot to be the entity that gives you a massage, for example. You probably would require a human being. You probably would not require a robot to tell you a diagnosis of your disease. You probably need a doctor, you know, because he's able to, you know, to give you the information in a way that you will be able to manage it, because he understands human feelings. Yeah. So I think multidisciplinary education is the key.
So, thanks very much for the issues you raised, you know. And because we're dealing with this also in a pedagogic way is important there. Schumpeter wasn't anti-Marx. He rated Marx as one of the 3 greatest economists. That's the title of his book. Yeah. What he was against is Marxism and the things that follow it. Yeah, so let's be clear. Yeah. I want to cover the issues in the following way. Yeah? Firstly, capital needs people for surplus extraction. This is a fundamental in political economy. When the opportunity for extracting surpluses from people's labor no longer exists, you cannot call it capitalism. Hence the notion of post. What are we going into? Paul Mason's good book about it, yeah, which has some problems associated with it as well. But I think that's important. That's why I keep bringing it back to these types of issues. Because I worry what this building teaches people, to put it to you that way. Yeah? It doesn't teach people that. And that's a worry for me, because people think you can make money from machines. Machines can make you money, but you can't make money from machines, as in surplus extraction. That only comes from exploiting people's labor, which is sold to you less than the cost of the product that's realized. It's a fundamental. Number 3, flowing from the, I mentioned the post-capitalism and Paul Mason stuff. There's no free stuff. You know, I think we've been together and speaking about this as well. Everything has costs associated with it. But where those costs translate into prices is based on those making the decisions. They're boards. For example, the bandwidth that we could be sharing on this facility. How much should it cost us if it's already here? When we shift finally from analog to digital and more bandwidth is created, we'll run an auction and it will be sold to private firms. That will then be sold to you as airtime coming from that. So you see, I mean, there's all of these decisions that take place. And I share this worry about the dystopia, but maybe it isn't as bad as people being plugged into the machine. Yeah, the Matrix story as yet. But that's kind of the dystopia that seems to be presenting itself at present. As we remind ourselves of our own history itself, yeah? It's not Elon Musk that invented basic income. our civil society, and COSATU in particular, were almost crushed because of the demand of a basic income during the transition. And I'm sure, I was going to say comrades, but at least some of you, and colleagues, you would realize the difference in terms of where we've been sitting today relative to this multitude of small grants being chucked out, as opposed to providing livelihoods, so that the inhumanity that coexists with us sitting inside here is excluded. And those that you described in various forms of precarious labor are also excluded from that possibility. Yeah? Last one from me. The reason I raised that there were many surges during capitalism's expansion is each surge laid out infrastructures. Those infrastructures allowed the following surge to take place with a reduced cost. In other words, public goods were generated. I've come to you from Tshwane. I assume that remains a public good, what I'm driving on. I keep getting bills every month for me to pay for it. Rent on driving here. Yeah. You see what I mean by this? These choices we are making. So what I'm urging is a caution. And the caution being, without the infrastructures from 1771 till now, you know, the type of possibilities available to us are constrained. And because of that, those with most privilege currently are those that would manage to capture most of the advantages that we are talking about that actually is becoming possible.
Jane, before you answer, I just want everybody to know that it is 1:02, although we can keep going as long, and yeah, so if you want to go grab lunch, you can, but Jane, if you'd like to answer the 3 questions or respond to them before we take other ones.
Yeah, I don't think there were any questions that were directed to me. I mean, I think, yeah. I think let's open it up.
Okay. Maybe I just want to respond to Rasigal when you say that capitalism requires surplus labor for it to be considered. I actually think that is not correct. It requires profit. It just happens that one of the sources of profit was surplus labor. Now, if machines are able to give you that profit, capitalism will continue to be capitalism. Of course, exploitation will be out of the picture. It will be irrelevant that will come into the picture.
Lovely. I saw a lot of hands. I'm getting very eager hands, so I'm going to have to cut that short. So I saw that gentleman first, and I saw this gentleman in the hat. A third one, anyone? And we go here. So let's start with you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Setseki. I came here from private activist.
Okay.
I think the debate or the discussion should assist us, as the title says, rethinking the African economy. And in this session, it's quite important to say, what do we do? What are the solutions? How do we move forward to do that rethinking or revise? Because I would request the presenters, Jane, I think I don't have much question from you because I understand exactly from where you are coming from. But I think the presenters should assist us to have solutions for the future. How do we resolve this? An example, I normally say in my previous life that South Africa and Africa is very wealthy. But the issue of distribution is a challenge. Now, distribution links with those that govern. The manifesto will say, the World Manifesto, I call it the World Manifesto, Communist Manifesto, that the new executive manages the affairs of the bourgeoisie as a whole. Now, since 1994, we have seen different slogans and different movements and different people coming into the state, into power, political power. But the bourgeois continue to reap this profit. Give us the answers. How do we move out of this bondage of a rich Africa, but poor in existence? Thank you.
I'm very interested. I mean, I thought all the presentations were really great. Obviously, there's a lot more time we need to discuss all of these things. So I'm just going to hone in. Okay. So I think it was Google technicians that said, we're not supplying this technology to Trump. Now, my question, you know, we can think of, as Devin suggested, a trade union of informal workers, although I think workers resist, not just through trade unions. I think this notion that workers' organizations only trade unions needs to be dealt with. Jane will probably also tell you that 29% of workers are in trade unions, the rest aren't. And so are they unorganized? Do they have no voice? They might form cooperatives, etc. That's not my point. I want to ask all of you, where are the vulnerabilities? So this production of artificial intelligence, of a new way of making profit under capitalism, generates a class or faction or group, or I'm probably using the wrong word. They are workers, if we call technicians workers. How do you organize that? Because with due respect to the last speaker, I'm not looking for answers at the front. Because they don't have the power, as you should know, where you come from. So my question is, where are the vulnerabilities? The prof, or one of the profs, what's the counter to Google and the cell phone companies knowing where we are and supplying that information to the intelligence services? Are you working on that to provide us with how to resist? So, you know, where's the resistance technology? My understanding of the word sabotage, it comes from the French word for a shoe. Because in the first or second or whatever your periodization of technology is, you took off your shoe and you threw it in the machine and you stopped it. Now there are young hackers that can hack into the Pentagon for a pat on the back, not necessarily to make money. How do we capture that resource for the resistance?
Hi everyone, my name is Reinhard, I'm from the WWF. Sorry, excuse me, I've just got some notes on my phone here. So really interesting discussions, and I think this two-day event is also really interesting. Some fascinating topics and themes coming out from the program. But I think there's one glaring omission in the program, and I think it's echoed in this session as well, is the lack of consideration for the environment. What about environmental considerations? So climate change, I think, is the most obvious one. How is climate change going to affect jobs in the future, and how is our response to climate change also going to affect jobs and issues of inequality, poverty, etc.? So up front, I was taught environmental economics from a neoliberal perspective, where you can place a value on the environment, and I think the water diamond paradox sums up the problems there. So my question is, how can we use alternative economic thought to address, one, the environmental problem, and two, the potential trade-offs with addressing that problem, and then dealing with those repercussions, such as, for example, if we move from a coal-based electricity system to a renewable one, there's going to be tremendous job losses in the coal sector.
So may I ask you answers within 5 minutes?
Okay, should I shoot? Maybe I could just pick up the environmental question first. Certainly, yeah, I guess constraints of time, but it is often unfortunate that the environmental discussion, when there is a constraint of time, does get sidelined. So apologies for that. But certainly in WeGo, particularly amongst our waste pickers, organized waste pickers all over the world, the environmental issue is absolutely central, both to the work that they do and to their struggle for recognition. Because, and just taking the example of South Africa, the contribution that the informal recyclers make to the removal of recyclables from the landfill sites, either through preventing them going there in the first place or moving them off the landfill. You know, they basically effectively reduce the quantity of the volumes on the landfills extraordinarily, you know, by sort of 80%. We have a big project at the moment with waste pickers in organizing in coastal cities, and as we all know, you know, coastal marine pollution is a huge issue at the moment. So yeah, there's lots of environmental ways in which questions of the environment and climate change are very embedded in the work of recyclers, and embedded in their argument, organized recyclers' argument for compensation not only for the value of the recyclables that they put into the market, but also compensation from the state, whether it's local authority or national government, for their contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving the environment generally. So there is certainly in our work a very deep integration of those issues. On the question that Putus asked, I mean, I take Rob's point, you know, the answers are not going to come from here. But certainly in the case of informality and informal employment, you know, I think our argument would be that we should get away from this notion, a very sort of traditionalist notion that somehow expects that there will be expansion in the industrial sector and that work and employment will come from the industrial sector. And particularly if we bear in mind the technology innovations and robotics and so on in the industrial sector, manufacturing in particular, you know, we can see the decline in employment in those sectors. And obviously we would want expansion, and there are things we need to do to intervene to stop the shrinkage. But where we need to focus is where work is already taking place outside of what we normally see and envisage as part of our policy debate. And that's in the informal employment milieu. And so we have to make direct interventions there that help improve the conditions of work and the livelihoods of those who work outside of a formal employment relationship. And that means a lot more intervention and innovation on the part of the state, whether it's the central state or in particular local authorities, to create an enabling environment where work that isn't under an informal employment relationship is nevertheless recognized and enhanced and made safe and produces a livelihood that equates to more than a living wage.
Okay. Unfortunately, I will have to run now. Maybe just to answer, no, I think no, we are obviously not going to be able to answer some of these questions because these are difficult questions. What, you know, how do we guarantee employment in the presence of these huge technological changes that we have never witnessed before? There are no ready-made answers. And these are big issues that are defining our time. and collectively we will have to try to find solutions to this. How do you organize people? How do you create trade unions? Maybe you shouldn't call it trade unions, because trade unions assumes that you are organizing people who are already in some form of a trade. If you are an unemployed person sitting in Kano, where I come from, you don't have a trade. And because of that, it's far much difficult to organize you, because where do you exert pressure points? Whereas if you are in a trade, we know that if you stop what you're doing, then production does not happen. And because of that, whoever controls that production will want to resolve that issue quite quickly. So we just need to imagine some other form of organization that will be, and identify the pressure points that we need to exert. Now, Google and resistance.
Sorry, I'm just going to cut you short. Sorry. We're officially 1:15. Lunch has begun. So could I cut you short and ask that you answer, and then we'll have to, yeah. Okay. So maybe you can go ahead and answer.
The last issue that I wanted to say is that you need to be involved. We need to make new laws that are going to regulate Facebook. We don't have laws that do that in South Africa. We as people should not just sell our data, because it's a choice that you make. And you can't expect government to come and say we are banning you from having access to. We just need to be conscientious about the decisions that we make.
So also, I'll be very rapid. I know I'm standing between you and that lunch, but the ecological question is paramount. And if you look at work that we've already published, you'll see how we reconcile some of these issues. Some of these technologies have huge demands placed on electricity in scarcity that then aggravates situations. On the other hand, some of the processes allow for distributed networks, and that threatens existing monopolies, etc. So these are things we need to balance across. But planetary boundaries is what needs to guide our choices. We don't have an infinite scope, right? To our colleagues at the back, I hope both of you, if I'm looking at you, you would also recognize something called educate, organize, and mobilize. We need to do more of it. It's not that it ends at some point now that we have a formation. And increasingly, as those in employment of a variety of types, these people are not coming to organization because of what they see happening in organized labor. Into the trade unions, as Prof. Marwala said. And there's a range of alternative formations that are appearing. And that's what we need to pay much more attention to. From the theoretical base that I've raised with you, and I really encourage, especially those that contribute back to this, changes in the labor process fundamentally will change the forces of production. Because of that, the relations of production cannot remain the same. And in that, political economy change totally will lead to a change in the mode of production, and that answers the two colleagues at the back in the most bluntest form. Capitalism cannot continue.